In July of 1935, Harold Chamberlain and Orville Moore were each awaiting trial in La Crosse for their crimes. They were being held in the La Crosse County Jail at 10th and Zeisler Streets, northeast of downtown on the southern edge of the La Crosse River Marsh. The building served as the county's third jail building from 1890 to 1965. It was a formidable building of stone and brick that gave the illusion of an impenetrable fortress. It was the first county jail to have separate areas for females and juveniles and featured a hospital ward as well.
Harold Chamberlain was a 19-year-old auto thief, originally from the La Crosse area. He had been in trouble with the law since the age of 12 when he was caught stealing cars. He was repeatedly sent to the state industrial school as punishment, but every time he was paroled, he would get arrested again. Upon turning 18, the year before the events of 1935, he began a 3-month sentence of hard labor in the La Crosse County Jail. This did not deter him from his life of crime, however. He was arrested in May of 1935 for stealing a modern laundry company vehicle. At the time of the events in July, Chamberlain was being held for trial in October. Orville Moore was a 35-year-old career criminal with a national reputation. In June earlier that year, Moore and a female accomplice had broken into a home on Caledonia Street after first impersonating a federal officer to scope it out. He was captured in Illinois and brought back to La Crosse by Police Captain Herman Rick. Moore and Chamberlain were inmates on the same cell block and evidently became very chummy, so much so that they had to be separated. Unknown to the jailers, their conversations had included plans to escape at a time in which both the sheriff and undersheriff were out of the building. On July 20th of 1935, while both men were out of their cells, Chamberlain attacked a fellow inmate, Dewey Meinertz, which was meant to be a diversion, while Moore attacked jailer Robert Garrow with a straight razor he had hidden in his sleeve. Garrow gave Moore his set of keys, which allowed Moore and Chamberlain to escape. Moore and Chamberlain locked Meinertz and Garrow into an office. Chamberlain knew where the guns were kept and forced his way into a locked compartment with a tire iron. He took a riot gun, a machine gun, and 2 revolvers. The commotion was heard by the jailer's gardener, Andrew Youngin, who called the police. Youngin, in a panic, asked the cops to come to the jail right away, but made no reference to a jailbreak. The call was answered by officers Clarence Koblitz, Aaron Sanford, Joseph McGrath, and Jack Fitzpatrick. These officers later reported that they presumed they were responding to prisoners fighting among themselves at the jail. Fortunately, Fitzpatrick was known as a great driver, and Koblitz grabbed a .30-30 rifle on the way out of the station. Once out of the jail, Moore and Chamberlain found an unoccupied cab and took off. Unfortunately for them, the cab had been fitted with a device that prevented cab employees from driving at excessive speed. With Chamberlain driving, they headed downtown. The police caught up with them at 2nd and La Crosse Streets, right around the entrance to the Oktoberfest grounds today. Once the police caught up with them, the fugitives fired on the squad car. The police did not return fire right away. Heading south on 2nd Street, Chamberlain suddenly pulled over. The officers assumed they were giving up, so Officer Sanford jumped from the squad car and approached the back of the cab. Suddenly, through the window, he saw a gun being raised. He dropped to the ground just as a shot blew out the back window of the cab and went flying over his head. From the squad car, Officer Koblitz fired his rifle as the cab started to pull away. Chamberlain was struck in the neck and back, killing him instantly. Moore frantically pulled his dead partner from behind the wheel and took off driving. The moving gunfight raced down 2nd Street toward the old wagon bridge that spanned the Mississippi River toward Minnesota. Moore, driving now, fired at police when he could. Officers Koblitz and Sanford returned fire while standing on the squad car's running boards, with Fitzpatrick at the wheel. The chase continued over the bridge onto Barren Island, with both vehicles dodging in and out of traffic. As the chase crossed the West Channel Bridge about a mile from the Crescent, Moore was hit. The cab swerved and struck 10 guardrails before coming to a stop. Moore and Chamberlain were now both dead.
This jailbreak event changed the way in which the police handle these kinds of calls. The communication or lack of communication between the caller, the dispatcher, and the police officers was duly noted by police and La Crosse citizens. While the police department had purchased bulletproof vests and an armored vehicle shortly before this incident, the responding officers had no idea of the severity of the situation that they would be facing. Instead, they chose to respond more quickly to the call, even though they could have brought better equipment. Conditions required Officer Clarence Koblitz to leave his partner, Detective Aaron Sanford, alone in the street. Because there wasn't any radio communication, Sanford wound up hitching a ride back to La Crosse to summon an ambulance and the coroner. Because the public expressed their concern for the situation that could have been much more serious in the end for both the police department and La Crosse citizens, Police Chief John Weber didn't waste any time requesting funds from the Common Council for the cost of a two-way radio system. Because the council representatives thought the cost was too high and the chances of needing such technology in a city the size of La Crosse were so low, it wasn't until July 1938, nearly 2 years later, that the police radio station was finally up and running. Squad cars were then equipped with radios so that the Central Police Station could communicate with officers and vice versa. Interestingly, the bullet-riddled stolen cab was exhibited for many years at the annual La Crosse County Interstate Fair, a silent reminder to attendees, especially the youth, about the dangers and seriousness of crime. It was as though the car was saying, "Don't let this happen to you." The bodega was founded by Julius Fries in 1897, and it was a traditional bar where the current Jules Coffee Shop is located in the 300 block of Pearl Street, and it was then known as the Monarch Tavern. Fries expanded into the next building on 4th Street to open a pool hall portion of the business, and then he renamed this the bodega. Fries offered a free lunch counter within a buffet, which was well known for its good meats and appetizers, particularly its prime roast beef. During Prohibition, the pool hall became an expanded cafeteria. The Bodega Lunch Club was more of a restaurant than bar during the time when George Brooks worked there. Cigars, sweets and candy, homemade donuts, and good food were advertised, as well as the soda counter. It was considered very elegant and modern during this time.
George Brooks was born in Onalaska and lived in La Crosse for his entire adult life. He worked as a soda jerk at the Bodega Lunch Club for over 40 years, but that was really just his day job to pay the bills. His real work was catching criminals and locating people who were missing. He was so good at it that he was known to be one of the best bloodhound trainers in North America, and he took the work very seriously. He trained himself and his dogs every day of the year. He didn't have hobbies, he didn't go out to the movies, he didn't drink, and he ate basically only protein. When he bought his first bloodhound in 1932, she came from England, so he not only paid for the dog, but also her shipping expenses. To make this large of an investment as a working class resident in a small Midwestern city during the early years of the Great Depression, that was a really big deal. He'd likely saved for years. Whenever he was asked why he did it in interviews, he usually said that he wanted to go outside more or that he liked helping people. And he said that when he was 12 years old, he decided that he wanted a year-round dog. He didn't really see the point of training hunting dogs if he couldn't use them all year round. So instead of hunting game, he trained the bloodhounds to hunt people, to track people. When he bought Lady, his first bloodhound, people knew. News like that travels fast. So Chief Wool of the La Crosse Police Department hears this, and he's the one who approaches Brooks. Brooks had only had Lady for a few days when Wool asked if he thought that Lady could track some guys who had attempted to rob a bank up in Maduro. Brooks wasn't really sure, but Wool was desperate. 2 of the 3 suspects had escaped into the woods near Black River Falls, and Wool had this 100-man posse, but there was really no good without an idea of which direction they should go in to catch the guys. When they got to the scene, Brooks watched in amazement as Lady, a 4-month-old puppy, instinctively started to work. He hadn't even started training her yet, and she tracked the scent to a stream. Other people in the search party tried to lead Lady across the water, but Brooks saw that she was really only interested in that stream. Later, the robbers were arrested in Iowa. Brooks decided to visit them in jail and try to figure out how they tricked Lady. And when he asked them, they told Brooks that they were from the South, so they knew how to evade bloodhounds. They knew of an old trick where if you go into deeper water and breathe through the hollow reeds, the bloodhounds track the scent to the water. But the human trackers don't typically know how to interpret that, and they put the dogs in another direction. They told Brooks that if he had turned her loose, that she definitely would have found them in no time. That's how Brooks really learned to follow the lead of his dogs. He would let his dogs tell him where to go and what to do. He used a system of harnesses and belts to keep up with the dogs when they were tracking, and that allowed his hands to be free for a weapon or a flashlight. Brooks had a system for training his dogs. He would hire a kid or a group of kids who often hung around the bodega waiting for Brooks to need them. And then he'd have that kid create a trail around the city, through downtown, the marsh, the bluffs, anywhere the kid wanted. Brooks paid them 25 cents a trail and usually gave them an ice cream cone too. Brooks stressed that his bloodhounds would only be successful if they had two things. One, what he called a scent guide, which is an object that the missing person had handled, so a handkerchief or a teddy bear or something like that. And two, knowledge of the last place that the person walked. That way, Brooks could get the dogs onto the right trail. The dogs could easily be distracted by another trail that they found more interesting if Brooks wasn't careful. One of Brooks's most famous cases was a man named Ray Olson who was called the Northwood Slayer in newspapers. It was reported across the country in June of 1939. Olson had stolen a car and in his attempts to evade law enforcement, killed 2 deputies up near Hayward, Wisconsin. They called in George Brooks, who was flown in on a private plane. And when he arrived, there were hundreds of people congregated in a posse, throwing off the dogs. Brooks didn't have a scent guide, and he didn't know Olson's last location before he disappeared into the woods. But the dogs managed to find a trail near the cabin that Olson had stayed in, and Brooks had no choice but to allow them to follow it. It was their best and only lead. The chase lasted nearly 2 weeks, and Olson knew that they were hot on his heels the whole time. At one point, he burned down a cabin that he slept in to destroy his scent, but the dogs only walked around the burned site and kept following the trail. Eventually, the posse caught up to Olson, and the police shot him as he ran towards a boat on a lake near Cable, Wisconsin. Another impressive case Brooks and his bloodhounds worked on involved a farmer named Jens Thompson from Freeborn, Minnesota. In the summer of 1937, Thompson shot 3 brothers from a neighboring family and took off. Brooks tracked with his dogs for over 4 days without any sign that they were on the right trail. And it was during this awful drought, so the air and the ground were dry, which made the trails harder for the dogs to follow and was really quite dangerous for their health as well. One of the dogs, named King, who Brooks later said was one of the best trackers of his career, developed a hemorrhage of the lungs and began to bleed out of his mouth. But King kept on going, following the trail. Brooks slept along that trail with his dogs without shelter or blankets for 12 days. Thompson was becoming desperate to throw off the dogs, and at one point he jumped off of a 35-foot cliff to try and trick them, but they simply tried to jump off the cliff as well. And if it weren't for their harnesses, they would have. The sheriff even bribed Brooks $5,000 to let the dogs loose, but Brooks said that that put the dogs at risk, and he didn't want Thompson to shoot them when they approached. They had chased Thompson across 4 counties at this point, and when they caught him, it was a few miles north of Houston, Minnesota. He was so exhausted that he surrendered without struggle.
George Brooks, like many people in La Crosse, volunteered to help with the Evelyn Hartley missing persons case in October 1953, the famous case of the missing babysitter. Presumably abducted in a violent manner, Evelyn Hartley was a 15-year-old Central High School student babysitting for a family friend during the college homecoming football game. Brooks was probably dubious about the Bloodhounds' success, knowing that the crime scene had been trampled over by many gawkers. The police did not rope off the crime scene like they do today to help preserve the evidence. In fact, the state crime lab didn't even arrive until the following Monday to collect evidence. Brooks would normally prefer an article of clothing from the missing person to start his dogs on the trail. Sadly, the dogs lost the scent after progressing only 2 blocks from where Evelyn was babysitting, partway down the next street. It was presumed that Evelyn was whisked away in an automobile and the dogs were unable to track the scent any further. I'm sure George felt very badly that he and his famous dogs were unable to help in this case.
The Saturday Evening Post, which was one of the most widely read and influential magazines in the nation at the time, sent a reporter in 1949 named Daniel P. Mannix to La Crosse for a week-long trip to shadow Brooks and do a story on him and his dogs. A front-page La Crosse Tribune article reported that local folks had a new appreciation for George Brooks. It turned out that most people in the area had no idea that Brooks and his Bloodhounds had already solved over 2,000 cases by 1949, or that only a handful of people in the world trained Bloodhounds as well as George Brooks. Nearly 20 years later, that reporter, Daniel P. Mannix, wrote the award-winning novel The Fox and the Hound. I never found a source that Mannix ever credited George Brooks and his Bloodhounds as inspiration, but I think it's very possible that this week of research here in La Crosse likely gave him some knowledge and inspiration that went into his novel. One important plot point in The Fox and the Hound that was later left out of the Disney adaptation involves the character Chief, a coonhound, dying after running in front of an oncoming train while following the trail of Todd, the fox. In the Post article about Brooks, Mannix wrote about how Brooks always kept his dog on a leash. He wrote, "A bloodhound following a trail is completely indifferent to everything else and will walk in front of a speeding car or straight into an oncoming train." Between 1932 and 1960, George Brooks and his Bloodhounds assisted in over 3,000 cases. Most of these cases were missing persons and lost children who had wandered away from their homes. Brooks suffered from a major heart attack in 1959. He had heart surgery and was hopeful that he would get back out there with his dogs after some rest, but he never did. He retired both from the bodega and from tracking in 1960, but continued to live with Bloodhounds until his death.
Oscar Swenis was the La Crosse city attorney from 1919 until 1935. Oscar grew up on the north side, not too far from the rail yard, and for some children of the era, the temptation to freight hop was too hard to fight, despite many warnings from their parents. Children would hop on the train cars as they left the rail yard and hitch rides around the area. When Oscar was 12, he was trying to hop on a train car when he slipped and fell, his right leg landing on the tracks. It was crushed and couldn't be saved, and a doctor had to amputate it just below the knee. Oscar wore a prosthetic leg for the rest of his life. This did not keep him from being active at school. He attended La Crosse High School, as it was known then, and was involved in debate clubs there. Oscar had worked as a clerk in the law office of Jesse Higbee after graduating from high school. Higbee was the city attorney at that time. After a few years as a clerk, Oscar attended law school in Madison and actually passed the state bar exam without completing his degree, something that wasn't allowed too much longer after Oscar did it. As Higbee looked at stepping down from his role, he recommended Oscar for the position. As city attorney, and the city council took his suggestion. In 1935, city attorney was a part-time role, allowing Oscar to run his own practice out of his office in the Rivoli building, while also serving as Onalaska city attorney. According to newspaper accounts, his particular area of interest was public utilities law, and he was on the board of public works. Oscar was given the nickname the $2,700 city attorney by H.E. Wheaton, the editor of a weekly newspaper in Hoka, Minnesota. The salaries of city officials had recently been published by the La Crosse Tribune, as they typically were when a budget was up for approval. And Wheaton made it apparent that he disagreed with the amount that Oscar Swenis was being paid. Wheaton often wrote his editorials in a blind item style without using the full names of those who he was writing about. So he would often refer to Oscar as the $2,700 city attorney. The irony was that Oscar's salary, which had been set in the 1934 budget, was only about $2,400, with a $300 allowance for a clerk. Irene Swenis was Oscar's wife of 13 years. She grew up in La Crosse, one of 6 children, and went on to graduate from the Wisconsin Business University, which had been located downtown. She worked as a stenographer for a few law firms and banks before setting up her own office in 1922 on the 4th floor of the Rivoli building, across the hall from the law office of Higbee and Swenis. In July of that year, Oscar and Irene were married in St. Paul. In the summer of 1935, Irene had taken a trip without Oscar that included visiting the Black Hills of South Dakota, Yellowstone National Park, and Estes Park in Colorado, a trip that at the time could have lasted a number of weeks. Irene had just returned from her trip on Wednesday, August 14th, 1935. The evening of Wednesday, August 14th, 1935, Oscar had a meeting with some officials from the U.S. Navigation Service. They met at the Hotel La Crosse, which was just across the street from the old courthouse. The meeting ran rather late into the night, with Oscar leaving his car downtown and being dropped off at home at approximately 2:30 in the morning by the city street superintendent, who was also at the meeting. On Thursday morning, Oscar was expected at a meeting at 11 a.m. with the mayor and the city council. Oscar was supposed to speak at the meeting, so the council members waited 40 minutes, all while trying to determine where he was. Oscar's car had been left parked downtown the night before, which probably added to the confusion. It was the Swennes' next-door neighbor, Bernice Stormont, that first noticed a smell of gas and determined that it was coming from the Swennes home. Mrs. Stormont was quoted in the La Crosse Tribune that she had first tried to reach Mrs. Swennes' family, but couldn't get hold of anyone. Her husband then called the police. When they arrived, it was reported that they could not get in through the door and instead cut a window screen to gain access. The bodies of Oscar and Irene were discovered inside. Irene was found dead in the kitchen near the open door of the oven. Oscar was found upstairs in their bedroom with a gunshot wound to his head. He was still alive, but unconscious, and police had him taken to Grandview Hospital, which was across the street. Police concluded that Irene had shot Oscar over what they had called domestic difficulties. Newspaper articles speculated that the domestic difficulty had to do with an issue of the Hoka Chief weekly paper that was found in the home. In that particular issue, Oscar was accused of leading a double life and meeting up with a woman who also worked in the Rivoli building. A note was left behind by Mrs. Swennes, though it was originally written in July. The note was seen as a final will and testament because it only contained a few sentences in which Irene asks that all her possessions go to her sister. The envelope that it was in had been sealed, but on the outside of it, Irene made one final request, that she be buried next to Oscar. Oscar never regained consciousness and died from his injuries early in the morning of August 16, 1935. A double funeral was held the following Monday. He and Irene were buried together, just as Irene had requested in her final note. We don't know why H.E. Wheaton targeted Oscar so often and so harshly, but the accusation he made in the July 11th issue of the Hoka Chief was severe. Without naming Oscar, Wheaton implied that he was seeing someone after hours who lived on 10th Street and who worked for the La Crosse Theaters Company. On a Sunday morning in October, occupants of an apartment building on 10th Street reported smelling natural gas. It was coming from Ruth Bradfield's apartment. Police were able to break open the door, which had been taped shut from the inside. They found Ruth's body slumped in a chair in front of the open oven with the gas jets turned on. Ruth had been a secretary at the offices of the La Crosse Theaters Company in the Rivoli building, the same building that Oscar had his office in. The report of her death was printed in several papers in the state, and some of them quoted close friends as saying that she had recently been distraught over the deaths of Oscar and Irene. We can only speculate how the general public may have felt about what they were reading in the newspaper, given the day and age. What we do know is that public offices were closed on the day of the funeral to allow city officials to attend, and a memorial resolution was read in tribute to Oscar at the city council meeting the following month. H.E. Wheaton was never charged with anything related to his article about Oscar Swennes, but he was sued for libel for many other articles that year. During sentencing, the judge scolded him harshly, and it's hard not to read into and apply it to the Swennes tragedy as well. H.E. Wheaton was fined that year for several libel cases against him. Though his paper was published out of Hoka, Wheaton and his family lived in La Crosse for a long time. Only 2 years after the events of 1935, Wheaton finally made a permanent move to Hoka. He died in 1954, shortly after selling his paper and seeing it merge with the La Crescent Times.